Thank you for being here. Thank you for accommodating our time change. We had to move the program forward in time because these excellent members of Congress need to leave in 45-ish minutes or so in order to get back for votes. And we have one more late arrival who will be joining us, Congressman Carter, as well. But first of all, welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. This is the place where we try to bring people together from across the aisle to find consensus and solutions and a path forward on some of the most difficult problems facing our country. My name is Dan Fishman. I'm the Senior Director of the Energy Program. And at the Energy Program, our focus is on American energy leadership and finding the kind of policies that can ensure that everyday Americans have access to affordable, reliable energy and an energy system that is decarbonizing. And we have to solve those problems at the same time. Affordability, decarbonization, we need to do both. It's not an either or. We have a couple of ACE alumni on the stage that I just want to call out. At BBC, we host this program called the American Congressional Exchange, where we have members of Congress visit each other's districts, get to know each other, see the perspective of another district in the United States. And a lot of times those relationships help continue in Congress and forge future policy work together. Congressman Graves and also Congresswoman Houlahan have been members of that program. But today we're here to talk about one of the most exciting topics in energy policy. Like, this is the kind of policy topic that gets people excited in the morning. And obviously I'm talking about the bureaucratic process that you need to go through to get a permit to build a project. Very exciting. But it turns out that this is one of the most impactful things we could do. And we're going to hear a lot about that today. Congressman Peters, we're going to start with you. You're a Democrat. You're a member of the new Democrat coalition. From the perspective of Democrats, why is permitting reform such a focus? Why is that something that you're going to show up at an event to talk just about permitting reform?
Well, I do think it's really critical, Zan, and I think Democrats should be all over this. We should be leading it, not worrying about it, particularly in energy, because 85% of what wants to be built today, or 90% of the projects that want to be built today in energy, are non-emitting, right? We're not playing defense like the 1970s where we were trying to stop things. If you're a climate activist today, you're trying to build stuff. You're trying to build transmission. Average transmission line takes 10 years to build, 7 years of that is process. You're trying to build offshore wind. You're trying to build utility scale solar, hydrogen pipelines, direct air capture. We need to build, build, build. And we've got these environmental laws, these relic environmental laws, antiques from the 1970s. They didn't come from Moses. They weren't written on tablets. They were written for those times when people were trying to stop bad projects. Now we're trying to build, and these are in our way. If we want to be climate activists, we have to be permit reformers. And I think it's really fundamental. I heard someone talking today at a hearing about about how NEPA relief is for polluters. That is exactly not true. It's actually for us. And if you want to say 15% of the projects are gas projects or whatever, fine. But you would give up 85. You would give up 15 to get 85. We should do that every day of the week. You do that the second time in the casino, they throw you out. That's such a good deal. You should take the deal. And that's why I'm really passionate about it, because it's great to have all this money in the bank, but it doesn't mean anything to the climate if we don't put it in the ground, and that's permitting.
Congresswoman Houlahan, the next question is for you. You are one of the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, along with Republican Congressman Garbarino. And that's a really cool caucus. You guys have been really active. There's a lot to work on. There's a lot of things in the bipartisan climate space. But one of your areas of focus really has been permitting reform. How did you guys arrive at the idea that should be a major bipartisan focus for the caucus?
Sure, and a lot of the reasons why Representative Peters was just outlining permitting reform's significance and importance are the reasons why the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus is focusing in on it. And I would argue that it's probably our #1 priority, and transmission might be a close second, and they are very related to one another. And so the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, which is a mouthful, is all of the things that are in the title. It's obviously bipartisan. There are 66 members of us now, and we are what's called a Noah's Ark caucus. And that means that one Democrat and one Republican join together. So it's always an equally balanced caucus, and that's significant. It's also significant, it's significant because that's uncommon, in Congress, unfortunately. It's also significant in its size. 66 out of 435 is a pretty darn large caucus. Some of the largest caucuses in Congress are, above the 50 membership. So that's significant because even when I just got here, which was just 5 years ago, there wasn't this kind of ability to meet in that kind of number at that kind of scale about an issue as important as climate. And so that's good. So this caucus gets together. It sort of constitutes itself at 66 or so people, and we try to put our heads together and think about the low-hanging fruit, what we have in common, and permitting reform is what we have in common. What we also have in common largely is that many of us were supportive of the IIJA, which is the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. Some of us were supportive of something called the IRA, which was a pretty significant piece of legislation. Both of them billions of dollars in investment in technologies and in energy sources and in carbon reduction that sits on the sidelines if we cannot address the permitting issue. And the permitting issue is tragic. We are creating pipelines of decades, in some cases generations, to get this kind of work done. And so I think that's why the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus has focused on this.
And I would note that your caucus is quite active. Right, I think there are a lot of there's hundreds and hundreds of caucuses in the House of Representatives, and some of them don't do all that much. You have regular briefings for your staff, regular briefings for your member. You take actions, you write letters. How have you been able to maintain such an active caucus, and how do you think you can leverage that?
Well, we have lots of work to do. We still could be significantly more active, in my opinion. And part of what I think our responsibility as co-chairs and co-leads is to try to provide what the value add is for members and their staffs to join us and to be regular participants. And part of what we're trying to do is education as much as anything. We bring in some pretty interesting briefers. We've had 6 meetings in the last, I think, year for members to be educated, and just as many, if not more, for staff members as well. Part of the problem is that this is super wonky and it's kind of esoteric, right? The stuff that we're talking about, and not many members sort of eat, sleep, and breathe things like permitting reform or transmission. And so we need to make sure that we're educating people, and I hope that that's part of why we are more active. And I also think that the permission structure in Congress has changed over the last 5 or 6 years, where I think there is an appetite for a conversation, a bipartisan conversation about climate. And that is something that's new. So I think that's also part of why it's more well-attended and more popular.
Congressman Graves, you have been on the permitting reform beat for years. You authored the Builder Act several Congresses ago. And some of the elements of the Builder Act you negotiated. You were a key negotiator in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, where we made what I would call modest improvements to our permitting regime. Can you talk a little bit about how you think that those improvements are going?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, I just want to frame things a little bit. I think Congressman Peters and Congresswoman Houlahan both did a good job laying things out, but I want to highlight one thing that Congressman Peters said. So folks have a different vision for the future, meaning what does our energy portfolio look like? What is oh, now we can get started.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, there we go. Good. This is great. Finally. Seriously, so you have a different vision of the future of energy portfolio, and certainly folks that are big renewable advocates do. But even folks who maybe aren't, because there is projected to be a surge in energy demand needed domestically and internationally. And what that means is that there's going to have to be change from what we have right now, which, as Congressman Peters lays out, which means you've got to build things. And so regulatory is absolutely critical. What we're able to do in the Fiscal Responsibility Act is we were able to make some changes, but one of the most important, in my opinion, is that we actually took a rock and we made new scribbles on that tablet that Congressman Peters was talking about. NEPA, ESA, Marine Mammal Protection Act, these laws, the Clean Water Act, they've always been viewed as being sacrosanct. You can't touch them. We touched them. We did 35 pages of law changes to the National Environmental Policy Act. In effect, the first time that's happened. We did things like narrowing the scope or putting sideboards on the scope of what you're actually doing in a NEPA analysis, looking at reasonably foreseeable impacts for the first time, actually putting some type of scoping in there. We came and we said, hey, look, instead of having a 5, a 10, a 15, and I've been involved in an 18-year NEPA analysis, we're going to limit it to 2 years. We're going to limit it to 150 pages. An environmental assessment, 1 year, 75 pages. Codifying the one federal agency, one decision maker instead of having decisions by committees. So a number of changes, including the categorical exchange, expanding the use of categorical exclusions, CADEX, expanding the use there. A number of other things, but things that one, showed that we actually can make changes to NEPA and some of these other laws. Number two, we can do it in a bipartisan way. And number three, that this is sort of the first step, and Congressman Peters and others have been very vocal about some of the other things that need to be done. Lastly, look, I don't think that the White House, in fact, not I don't think, the White House has not abided by the agreement. And the regulations they released, and the Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate who agree with this, it is a little frustrating because they wrote some things in that candidly they lost in negotiations. And they wrote them in the regulation, which I don't view as having good faith. So that's been a little frustrating, but overall, look, I'm celebrating this. We made changes to NEPA. We addressed some of the biggest challenges that are out there and have put better certainty on this law. But some of the things that Congressman Peters and Congressman Westerman are discussing right now, I think, are absolutely building upon that foundation and move us in the right direction.
Thank you. Congressman Carter, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Y'all don't wait on me. Go ahead and start.
I assume there were permitting delays.
There were permitting delays. Yes, that's it.
So I had originally intended to ask you the very first question.
Oh, good.
And
Cover for you, buddy.
Thank
I
you.
very cleverly
You endorsed
decided.
Kamala Harris.
I did. Wow. That's not going to go over well at home.
Yeah. Missing timelines. There's consequences. I very cleverly instead just started with question number 2. So now I'm going to backtrack to question number 1, which is to you. And you know, permitting reform isn't a new topic. Republicans in Congress have been pushing for permitting reform for quite a long time, many, many years. Some Democrats, mostly Republicans. And from your perspective, you know, what is the Republican case for why permitting reform is so important?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for a number of different reasons, but I want to lay the groundwork here. I think that, and I haven't obviously been here, but a lot of the focus on permitting reform seems to be on energy. But, you know, it's not just energy. It's every sector of our economy that permitting is having an impact on. I was in Houston, Texas last year 3 times. Every time I was there, it was the same story. Permitting, regulations, crushing us. But whether you're talking about energy, whether you're talking about healthcare, or whatever sector of our economy you're talking about, permitting has an impact, and in almost all the cases, a negative impact on our economy. And that's what we've got to keep in mind. I want to give you an example, and I don't think that this is apples and oranges. I think it's relevant. I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of coastline. Included in that is 2 major seaports, the Port of Savannah, the number 3 container port in the country, and the fastest growing container port in the country. In March of 2022, we finished the deepening of that port. It's called the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project. We went from 42-foot depth down to 47-foot depth. And that project was finished in March of 2022. You know when the permitting for that project started? 1996. 26 years it took to get that project completed. In that period of time, China has started and completed 3 ports. That's what we're talking about here. That's the kind of impact we're talking about. And again, I point to every sector in our economy. Healthcare is another example. You know, when you talk about hospitals, rural hospitals, trying to build a new hospital or trying to build a new healthcare facility, the permitting. And that's what I get frustrated with all administrations, with the federal government, that, you know, everything's got to be handled through regulation. It's not regulation, it's innovation. That's what we've got to have.
You know, I'm a Georgia native, born and raised in Augusta, so glad to share the stage with a fellow Georgian. You know, I think part of what you said is really interesting, because when we're thinking about permitting reform and we're thinking about permits, like what is the purpose of these permits, right? You want to have some kind of process so that you protect the environment and you protect people, but you want exactly the right amount of process, right? If you have too little process, it can be risky. If you have too much process, which I think is where we clearly are, you end up with a scenario where you're unnecessarily delaying good projects. You know, higher costs, and then we don't get the benefits of the projects. Congressman Peters, a pretty exciting thing happened a month or 2 ago, in that Senators Manchin and Barrasso, who were the chair and ranking member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, they released and then passed out of their committee a bipartisan permitting bill. And it passed by a vote of 15-4. Strong bipartisan vote. How do you think about what's in that bill? What do you like about it? Is there anything you're worried about? And you know, what do you think the House can do with that bill?
So I talked to Bruce Westerman about this, and Bruce's preference is that everything be kind of you set up rules that apply equally to every kind of technology. And the thing about this is it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. Look, I think it's really important that we pass it. I think it makes some really important reforms in transmission. I think for me, I think for a lot of us is really important. I would say too, by the way, on transmission, this is not the Democratic issue, really. This is the national issue, because of what Congressman Graves said about the demand for electricity. For the first time, demand for electricity in this country is going to go up a lot, and has been flat. Even though we've grown, we've been more efficient. With all the data centers and AI, with all the manufacturing that's coming back, in part because of the incentives we've passed, and part of the electrification, because of the electrification. If we don't build more transmission, whatever the generation source is, we're going to have blackouts. We're not going to be able to meet our power needs. It's that simple. It's a reliability issue. So we've got to get on it. But I think there's really important parts of that bill. It is, you know, it's sort of sector by sector, but I think it's very constructive, and you know, it does have some relief for natural gas. But again, like I said, you can't pass anything without a bipartisan vote. Nothing is going to be bipartisan if it doesn't include a range of solutions, and I think they've done a good job of putting something together. It was a lot of hard work, and I think we should support it. There will be more to do afterward, particularly on NEPA, but I think it's worth supporting.
Congressman Carter, like Congressman Peters, you're also on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. What are your thoughts on that Senate bill?
Well, admittedly, I have not had the opportunity to study it as much as I will, and I will, and my staff will, of course, keep me abreast of it as well. However, what we have looked at so far, there are some good parts to it, and I appreciate the bipartisan effort. I'm concerned about some other parts of it that, in the way of the cost. The transmission cost, particularly to customers, what the impact is going to be there. I'm concerned about, and my staff is concerned about, some of the things it didn't address. You know, and then, you know, quite honestly, and again, I couldn't agree with Scott Morris. There's got to be a bipartisan approach to this. But then again, you know, you're talking about some of the fixes to problems that we created, such as LNG. and the ban on that. I mean, you know, that shouldn't, we shouldn't have to fix something that shouldn't have been done in the first place. But nevertheless, you know, I go into it with an open mind, and I certainly appreciate the effort, but I've still got some serious study to do on it.
Congressman Graves, so you are on a different committee. You're on the House Natural Resources Committee, and that has a very different jurisdiction. And you know, just this morning, your committee held a hearing on 3 permitting-related bills. There was a bill by Congressman Westerman, which focused on amending NEPA and some judicial review changes, with a very different scope than what was in that Senate bill. You led a bill on a Congressional Review Act resolution around the administration's NEPA rulemaking. And there's also a bipartisan bill on getting some of the data behind timelines for the judicial review lawsuits and how long some of the timelines take. Could you, what do you think about what you heard this morning? What do you think the committee will be able to do to add to the conversation on permitting reform?
Sure. Well, look, one thing I want to note before getting into the details on the 3 bills, the Rudy Yakin bill, the one on the kind of data on NEPA, it's a bipartisan bill.
Yes.
The Congressional Review Act, it is bipartisan and bicameral, and I am optimistic that the Westerman bill, once it ultimately moves forward, is going to be bipartisan as well, and I think that's important. Just in terms of House Natural Resources compared to Senate Energy Committee, one of the things that I think is really important just to say out loud is that the Senators Barrasso and Manchin, they rightfully focused on their committee's jurisdiction, because if they went outside into Environment, Public Works, or Commerce, Science, Transportation, then you're going to have to deal with a much more complex legislative process. And so while there are significant limitations on what they've done, as Congressman Carter pointed out, I think that they did a pretty good job figuring out what they could do within their jurisdiction. Now, in the House Natural Resources Committee, Chairman Westerman, they have full jurisdiction over NEPA. They have jurisdiction over energy production. And so I think that a jurisdiction over ESA, jurisdiction over the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so there's a much larger suite of things that can be discussed in that committee, and you can do, as I think all of us here ultimately would like to truly fix this, and not come out and just sort of pick technological winners and losers, or industry sector winners and losers. So I do think that there's going to be an opportunity to do a broader fix in the House Natural Resources Committee. In regard to what I heard this morning, I want to be crystal clear. 95% of it was rhetoric today. The House Natural Resources Committee, for those of you that don't have the pleasure of watching that committee on a regular basis, it is one of the most partisan, dysfunctional committees in the Congress. It has a long history of this. I also serve on the House Transportation Committee, which has a great bipartisan cooperation, Big Four agreement on bills, and it's great to be there. It's incredible contrast to the House Natural Resources Committee. So look, let's be clear. There was a lot of rhetoric, but there were conversations or statements by Congresswoman Dingell, Congressman Lee, I think Congressman Salisbury, others that, and to some degree, there was a snippet, if you filter out all the junk, where Congressman Huffman said that he wanted to try and figure out something bipartisan as well. So look, I'm optimistic that we can do this, and I really want to thank Congressman Peters for being so practical, I think, and just thinking through this and recognizing that the only way you can achieve some of the change that you desire, and even if we have different objectives of what that change looks like to the two of us, that permitting regulatory is such a fundamental component of this that you have got to figure out how to make this better. And last thing, look, everybody comes to Congress and they bring some sort of background. And one of the challenges, and we were talking about this in the green room a little while ago, one of the challenges that I think we have on permitting and regulatory is, I said this earlier, I said that people look at a few of these laws as being sacrosanct. We don't have enough practitioners in this space that are on the Hill, people that truly understand how NEPA is supposed to work. And the objective is to try to protect the environment. This process has become the most arduous process in the world. When Jimmy Carter was president, and don't quote me because I'm probably gonna be wrong, but if I remember right, he said that under the Jimmy Carter administration, said that a EIS, I think he had a 1-year limitation on it, if I remember right. I think it was a 1-year limit during Jimmy Carter. We can all sit here today. Average road project takes 7 years and 4 months. A port project takes 8 years. I mean, this is crazy what's going on right now. And what's happened is that it has become such a unfocused process that you're no longer truly thinking about what are the impacts to the environment. Lastly, a lot of the projects we're trying to build are actually going to improve the environment, but the NEPA process is preventing us from moving forward on them. And so it really is crazy sometimes what happens. And we had a big environmental project in Louisiana. We actually were able to negotiate bipartisan basis a waiver on the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So every once in a while you can get things like that done, but bottom line is that I do remain optimistic that we can do something. I think what the Senate did was great momentum. I think that the conversations between Congressman Peters and Congressman Westerman make me really optimistic, and I know that Congresswoman Houlahan is also very interested in moving forward on something and allowing us to strike that right balance that really needs to be updated.
Well, I'm also optimistic, and I'm really glad that you're optimistic. I hope everybody in this room is optimistic, especially after hearing that. Congresswoman Houlahan, next question is to you.
Yeah.
You have a sign up in your office that talks about the values of your office, that says something along the lines of you value the good over the perfect. And, you know, I've heard it said different ways. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. How does that value inform how you think about both permitting reform itself and the bipartisan negotiations necessary to get a bill across the finish line?
So it's interesting that we talk about optimism. I joke with my office. In addition to being a vet and an entrepreneur, I also used to be a high school chemistry teacher and a literacy professional. And so I'm really into children's literacy and children's books. So I'm going somewhere with this. I always joke that I'm the Eeyore in the office and everyone else is the Tigger. You know, everyone else is the like, yes, we can do it and it's going to happen. And I'm like, it'll never happen. And you got to kind of have both, and we do in Congress have that sort of balance of it'll never happen and it's got to happen, it's going to happen. So I think the perfect and the good are the Tigger and the Eeyore. I think we can get this done, and I actually have hope, the Eeyore in the crowd, that we can possibly get this done in whatever amounts to the lame duck, because it has to be done. We have to get out of our own way. I think the efforts of the Senate have been pretty darn significant, and of course they're not perfect, and they definitely have a lot of trade-offs, and Pennsylvania is one of those places on the map where you can appreciate that we're pretty complicated, particularly in our relationship with energy and the kinds of conversations that we're having. But if we don't start from somewhere, something that came through the Senate and was bipartisanly supported, we're not going to go anywhere. And we have to, even people in the House have to be willing to take things, ideas that didn't come from us. And I think that's going to be a challenge. And perfecting them with other issues from other committees of jurisdiction, I think, will be a very useful and important exercise too. And so I guess what this expression in my office is really important. We are in a Congress, both the House and the Senate, where the margins are so slim and the degree of difficulty is so high that we can't afford to stand on principle all the time. We have to be able to compromise, and that's what that expression means.
Could I add to that?
Absolutely.
I think that's an excellent point, and I would submit to you that I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
No, I agree.
I think that the days of the 15 and 20 majority, I think those are over with. I think
agree.
Whichever way it goes, it's going to be tight.
But you
and
hear
we're
that-
going to have to work together.
You hear that in the halls of Congress. I've only been, this is my third term, but every term it's, just wait, we're going to get them. The next election, it's going to be all ours. And you name the issue. If it's not this, it's something else. And we can't wait around. We really need to get these things done.
The good news is that there's a whole center that is organized around bipartisan policymaking. Congressman Peters, I've heard you say before that NEPA is not the Bible. And we've actually had a bunch of biblical references already in this conversation. We've talked about the tablets from Moses. We've talked about Noah's Ark. Do we really need to wander for 40 years in the desert before we build a project? I don't know.
Help me, Jesus.
Or can we build a project in 7 days and 7 nights? That would probably be too fast. We probably couldn't accomplish that. That's not. But amending NEPA has historically been very controversial.
Yeah.
You get a lot of pushback on amending NEPA. Now, we did it. We in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, with a large bipartisan vote, we made some amendments to NEPA. Chair Westerman released and had a legislative hearing this morning on a bill that makes further amendments to NEPA and has some changes to judicial review. What are your thoughts on that bill and just generally the concept of amending NEPA and judicial review?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I think let's keep in mind what NEPA's role is. All NEPA was supposed to do is ensure that the government understands the environmental effects of the decision it's about to make and possibly does something to mitigate those effects. That's all. NEPA was passed before the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. What protects communities from pollution is the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Superfund bill and those substantive bills that prevent you from emitting stuff into the atmosphere without a permit. Those are there. That's good defense. And in terms of siting, no one is talking about getting rid of local zoning. Local zoning happens everywhere. That's tough enough to get through, right? I mean, I was on the city council. It was tough to build nice condos because zoning's hard. So there's plenty of defense out there. We ought to be looking at what is useful about NEPA. There's a legend that it's great for community input. Communities are well served and protected by this. Well, all I hear Democrats complain about is how all this crappy stuff is located next to communities of concern, the very ones NEPA is supposed to be helping for 54 years. Well, that ain't working, right? Do they get an opportunity to participate in upfront comments? Sure, but you find that most of the people who are participating in NEPA and litigating over NEPA are environmental groups who don't want to give that up and competitors of projects. And so I think you have to really look at what the value of this is. I think we could beef up community input to make it real. But the notion you have to have a 6-year statute of limitation, and people say to me, the argument is, well, I mean, I don't think 180 days would work. Why? Why? I mean, is climate change a crisis or not? So the changes that Bruce has suggested, a lot of them are really good. Here's my one thing that I haven't resolved yet, and the reason I'm not on the bill, but I'm going to get there, is that some of the changes about limiting the scope of review to particular jurisdiction, I wonder if those themselves are new targets for litigation and actually might slow down the process. And I haven't worked that through yet, but that's sort of my concern. I think that in the context of the climate crisis, when we want to build all this stuff, it behooves us all to look really closely at what the real benefits of NEPA are, and let's have a hard look at what we need out of it, because again and again, it's in the way of stuff. It's delaying things. And I'll tell you, I mean, my horror story is California high-speed rail. In 2008, we voted $9 billion, and we were told the voters, we were told that by 2030 we would be moving 100 million people a year on high-speed rail. Do you know the environmental review is not done on that yet? That's a failure. It's an outrage. And environmentalists are standing behind that because it seems that all they want to do is get the money in the bank and they think the project's done. No. And by the way, you know what's going to undermine the climate movement is when people are asked to vote on stuff like that again. We should be embarrassed. We should be pissed off as environmentalists that this is in the way. And environmental groups in DC should not be sitting on their hands. They should be leading the effort for permit reform. Because what it's about is saving the environment, whether it's saving sequoias or managing the forest right or building a energy transition, we need to get off our asses and get to work. And we can't be like looking at each other about whose feelings are going to be hurt. Let's get this changed. And I'm more and more certain that, as Ms. Houlahan said, it's got to get done, and it's got to get done. And if you call yourself an environmentalist, it's about mining, and it's about permit reform. It's about all that stuff you didn't like, that your parents didn't like in the 70s. But it's on us to do it. We're called to do it, and we should.
All right, we are going to do 2 quick lightning round questions, and then I'm going to try to take a question or 2 from the audience, and then these members have to go vote. All right, so the lightning question number 1. This is probably one of the most controversial topics. Is it permitting reform or permitting reform? Congressman Carter?
Permitting.
Permit reform, I like that, okay.
Permit.
Yes.
Permitting? Yes, great. All right, I heard a lot of different pronunciations this morning during the hearing. Serious question. Can we get this done? Can we get a bipartisan permitting bill done this year? Let's start on the other end this time. Congressman Graves, you're first.
Totally depends on the outcome of the election. I think that's what's going to largely dictate.
Ditto. I think it's going to be lame duck, if anything.
Hell yes.
Eeyore.
Tigger.
Tigger.
I just don't see how that's going to happen.
All right, a difference of opinion.
So how does Georgia transition from candlelight to light bulbs without this?
Yeah, that's right.
Shots fired, yeah.
Whew. All right. Well, okay. Is there a question or 2 from the audience for these fine members of Congress about permitting reform? Otherwise, I'll ask more questions. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about emissions. We can talk about either traditional pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. When we're thinking about the types of reforms, and maybe this could be in the context of the Senate deal, right? The Senate permitting bill has things like transmission reform and categorical exclusions for geothermal and for renewables on federal lands. And it also has oil and gas leasing, and it has LNG provisions. And when you think about all of those things, and you think about the overall emissions impact, is this the kind of reform that someone who really cares about climate should want to take the deal on? That's for any of you.
Can I jump? Is that right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at math and science here. EIA projections under the Biden administration show that you're going to have increasing natural gas demand up to 80%. You're going to have oil demand increase by up to, what was it, like 50% over the next 36 years. Okay, so number 1, this is global demand. Number 2, you look at where you have the lowest carbon intensity of those sources in the world. You know what it is? Gulf of Mexico. So from my perspective, you know you have increased demand. You know where the lowest carbon intensity is. Why aren't you connecting the dots? Now, let me be crystal clear on this. I am not saying you do that to the detriment of deploying renewable or solar, or wind or solar or hydro, geothermal or anything else. We are going to need every single bit of energy that we can produce, generate, all of it globally to meet these increasing demands. It's something, some folks have projected that you're going to have a 3 to 4 times increase in the entire grid build out.
Yep.
In order to meet demand in the United States. We started building the grid in like the 1920s, and we're going to have to, in the next, maybe is it 30 years? 30 years, triple or quadruple. I mean, think about these scales for a minute. It is impossible to do what we need to do under this mechanism. So I just think it's so important, instead of getting into all of the partisan ideology there and say, oh, I'm against oil or gas. Look at the math and science, develop a plan that is informed by that. Yeah. The lowest energy, the greatest energy emissions reduction in world history is what the United States did, over about a 15-year period during Republican and Democrat administrations. And the largest single component of that reduction in emissions was attributable to natural gas transition. I'm not saying that's the future and that's it, but it is going to be a part of the portfolio. We've got to be pragmatic about that. And I think that we absolutely, the bill is pragmatic. It really is. I think it looks at math and science and says, all right, this is the path forward. I want to be crystal clear. It's part of all of the above.
I agree. I think there's a really cool model. My background is in operations research and linear programming, and there's a really cool model that MIT has put out where you can ratchet things up, ratchet things down, see what the right solution is, optimize for whatever. And there is no way to really optimize the way that we need to hit the goals that we need to without that being the part of the solution. And I would also highlight from a national security standpoint, If we really are worried, and I am, about our place in the world and global security in general, we need to be the place where people are going for energy solutions, and part of that is this LNG as well. So I agree.
I think it should be all about emissions. This is, again, I agree with Garrett. I think one thing I'd say about natural gas, I'm a methane hawk. And I think you talk about carbon dioxide emissions, that's absolutely true. It totally burns cleaner than coal. But if you have fugitive emissions, 2.5%, you lose a lot of the climate benefit. The good news is we know how to do this, and that I think a lot of responsible companies are already doing it, and driven, I think, in large part by market demand from customers like South Korea and Japan and the EU who want clean gas. We have cleaner gas. I think we need to prove that, but I think we need to come up with a methane system by legislation that everyone can live with, that really works. But I think it should be about emissions, and that's why I think you don't take anything off the table, and the transition is going to happen. But as some Southerner said to me, it's not going to happen this evening. You have to understand it's going to be gradual over time, and I don't know, is that one of the things you say? But
I feel like they're coming after us.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do.
But,
that's okay. That's all right. Bring it
so
on.
I think rather than wait for the perfect, to go back to what Chrissy said, let's continue to make progress. And I think reducing emissions at every opportunity is the way to do that.
Ditto. I couldn't agree with my colleagues anymore. It's going to have to be all of the above. And I get very frustrated with the oil and gas industry, and I'm very critical of them because I don't think they've told the story like they should of the decrease in emissions that they've achieved over the years. And they have done that. They have gotten much better. The United States of America has decreased carbon emissions more in the last decade than the next 7 countries combined. Why don't we take credit for that? We should. Does that mean we stop and we don't try to do better? No, that's not what it means at all. And to try to make climate change a partisan issue, I think is totally erroneous. It is not. I believe in climate change. I believe it's real. I believe man has a part in that. And I believe we need to address it. Now, I don't subscribe to the theory that if we don't have it fixed by day after tomorrow, we're all going to fry. But I do think that we should get there. And how do we get there? And the way that we get there is going to be very important. You can't do it through regulation. You got to do it through innovation. And we've got to encourage innovation. And, I chair the Environment and Manufacturing Critical Minerals Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce. And one of the things that we want to do is to create a pro-business environment so that we can grow here in America. Look, being pro-business and pro-environment are not mutually exclusive. You can be both, and I believe we should be both. We can do this. I'm convinced we can do this, but we've got to do it in such a way that we are encouraging innovation, and we can't do it through regulation.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm leaving optimistic that sometime this calendar year, we're going to be able to pass a wonderful bipartisan permitting bill.
There are at least 4 votes.
4 out of 5. 4 out of 5 panelists agree. And we'll see exactly what it looks like. We've got a bipartisan bill in the Senate. We've got a discussion draft in the House that isn't bipartisan yet, but I think there's room for optimism that it could get there. And some combination of those bills really could become law. And if we do that, I think there's a lot to gain. We get affordable energy for Americans, reliable energy for Americans, decreased emissions, actually solving climate change, and of course, American leadership on the global scale, on the global stage in energy. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to let you get to votes. We have a reception right after this. So please stick around and continue the conversation. And please give a round of applause to our members of Congress.